just paint. Hi, and welcome to episode 2 of Just for Paint. In the last episode, what we did is we took a photograph of a scene, and then what we did was paint it roughly similar to that scene. The main differences is we used colors that weren't in the scene. We made whatever alterations, changes we wanted, because we abstracted from the original. Now, the main idea behind Just for Paint is to put paint on the canvas. It's really that simple. You have to allow your right brain to influence how and what you are doing to the canvas, the colors that you're choosing. You don't want to be analytical about it. You don't want to waste all this time trying to plan this grand piece of art. You just want to create it. You want to allow yourself the freedom and the relaxation of allowing the right brain to make the choices for you and just paint. In this episode, what we're going to do is start from nothing. We have a blank canvas. We're just going to start applying paint and see where it goes. It'll probably be a landscape style scene. It'll probably have mountains in it because I like mountains. I like the sky colors. I particularly like sky colors that are sunset and sunrise. So let's get started. Okay, we're ready to start. We have a basic palette, and in the palette we have 3 types of yellow, some magenta, some red, and some brown. And what we're going to do is make sure that we dip our brush in some terps as our medium, as well as we have a little mix that's got some linseed oil in it, and as well as it's got terps, making it very, very lean. And we're going to start some yellow, and we're just going to put it on, just nice and rough. Work it in a little bit, a little extra terps on there. And like I said, we're just going to work it in. A little more yellow. What we're working on here is a canvas board approximately 22 by 30 inches. Got some more, a different color of yellow. Move that in. This goes on really, really thin. Nice wide brush strokes. Once again, you're not concentrating a lot. What you're trying to do is just lay down a base coat on the canvas, but it's a thin, thin coat because we're going to be working wet on wet. We don't want the background to be too wet. We also don't want it to be too dry. So we just work it in. And we change yellows, go to another style of yellow, and work that in as well. It's a little odd painting when I'm not standing right in front of it, but let's see what can be done. Okay. You can tell if your paint is too wet. What you do is touch it lightly, and then when you look at your finger, if you can see the fingerprint through it, it's just right. It's wet enough without being too wet. Now, we're going to do a bit of oddness here because we're going to put just a little brown in the sky. Switch back, come on down here to your red. That little bit of red down at the bottom. One of the main things that people have a problem with is they actually try to blend far too much. You just want a blend a little bit so that the colors come together in the way that you want them to come together. We're starting to get a bit of the sunset effect. Now we want to get some white paint. Throw that on the palette, because we forgot earlier. You'll find that you go through an awful lot of white paint. Okay, get some of that excess paint off the brush. Soften the colors just a little bit. Using the white. We're not after a cloud effect yet. Just soften the colors a little bit. You're not worrying about brush lines or anything else. Now, we want to add a little purple to the sky. We have some real basic colors happening now in there. We're going to switch over to some palette knives. Palette knives, I used to think, were for scraping unwanted paint off the canvas, and I still use them for that. But they have multiple uses. You can put in some really fine lines. You can put really thick paint on. Really, it's up to you. I like to use them to accent the paint. We're creating some extra coloring through the sky. So one of the things we're after is that kind of color. It's also possible to use your brush like a palette knife. You'll find that your paint will slide around quite a bit, depending on how much undercoat of paint you actually have. Let your imagination go and just let the paint flow. I'm not that worried about lines. I'm not worried about what my final product is going to be. What I'm after is to see what kind of effects I'm actually going to get. Now, we can take a variety of different things, including fan brushes, and we can just work some edges if we want. Smooth some things down, move some things around, blend just ever so slightly, bring it all together. Work the painting. I'm not trying to overblend any of this. All I'm trying to do is create a flow of color. Just keep working some color into the painting until you or I, whoever happens to be doing the painting, is satisfied with the results. That becomes the basics for the sky. We can add a little bit more if we so desire. Or leave it the way it is. Now, the Rocky Mountains tend to, for the most part, year-round have a lot of snow on them. And because it happens to be spring and everything, right now there's still a lot of snow on it. So, what we want to do is take a little bit of painter's gray, a little bit of white, and get some of our colors for the mountains started up. So we got roughly some gray, dark gray, and then start putting in some basic, real basic shapes for the mountains. Using a palette knife. These are not the final definition. These are just our rough outlines. What we want to do is create a bit of capping effect. ran out of white again, so we have to add some more white to the palette. Clean the palette knife a little bit. And start adding some form to the mountains. Work with the colors you have in there, and that makes it far easier. And there's the start for your mountains. Okay, continuing on, we've added a few extra things here and there, and now we've got to put some green down because that's part of the foreground. It also gets extended up into the mountains, so we're using a light wash, lots of terps and medium, a little linseed oil, and we just wash it in nice and thin. Once again, we're not really that worried about covering the entire canvas. What we're worried about is getting a nice background green. Areas that we move the black down and in, we want to avoid that for right now, because we don't want to wash all that black into this green yet. Now, you take the green on the palette and work some of that into the baseline of the mountains. Nice and rough. And perhaps add just a little yellow coming in. Rinse your brush a little bit. Look for a fan brush. Put just a little yellow on there. corners up into the mountains. The black that we're using isn't actually black, it's painter's gray. So, pull the mountains down just a little bit into the foreground. And when I decide I don't like something, this is easy. To remove it. That went a lot darker than I wanted it to. So, as a result, what we did was just remove the excess paint. And we'll do it more again. Now we can start again. Make sure we keep the brush nice and clean. And we'll do more from there. Okay, now we're going to see how much we can actually correct on that. So, we're going to put some little grain up and towards the mountains. Simulation for trees. Using a fan brush, just poking the edges. Probably will require a little more green. Now we put a little yellow in there. Give us some contrast in the trees. Clean your brush as often as you think you need to. Mix a little color into it. Try and give it a little life. So for that we use purples or magenta, as well as we use the reds that we used in the top. And we're just starting to develop the scene. You have to remember what we're dealing with here, in my particular style, is abstract realism with a hint of impressionism. So we're not looking for the absolute realities of the scene. We're trying to bring color to life so that it looks like something that you can recognize, but it's not necessarily exactly the way things really look. The sunset, I've seen similar sunsets to this because this is big sky country. You get some wonderful, wonderful sunsets here, but not generally over the mountains. Generally, your sunrises look like that if you're looking east. But we can still use it. Now we've added a couple little extra lines, and what we're going to do is just start putting in some of our greens, the deep, 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 dark, dark greens. These are our background to the highlights. And once again, we're not necessarily overly careful about how we do this. We're just applying the paint in any manner that the paint really actually wants to go on. The idea is, once again, is just to get the paint on the canvas. And we're doing that. This will simulate the actual foothills that sit in front of the mountains. And once again, we'll add our extra colors. Slip a little white in there as well. try to let the scene come alive. Now we got a lot of wasted paint up here in the corner of the palette, so we'll just get rid of that for now. We'll add some new paint. A couple of nice yellows. Clean off the brush a little bit, get rid of some of that extra paint. There we go. Just keep dabbing the color in. Trying to add as much color as we can into it. Now we need one other color of paint, so we'll go find it. The Indian red is kind of an Indian red brown. And we just keep adding more and more paint. And that becomes the basics for the painting. You can add a few extra touches of color here and there, or wherever you decide you want. That's basically up to you to decide whether or not it's finished, if it meets whatever standards you've decided for it. Or not. For me, this is pretty much on the finished side. Little couple touches here and there. Come down a couple of tones here and there. And that's pretty much the finished picture. Now, when you're painting, the idea is to let the painting take over. Let the idea that's forming in your brain to take over. What we've developed is a simple scene. Basically it's a sunset, it's a set of mountains, it's some foothills. It's very basic when it comes to landscapes, but it has a high level of color, as well as it has the general shape of that particular type of scene. It's not accurate to the exact mountains, it's not accurate to the exact sky, but it's not purely an abstract either. So that's abstract realism with just a little bit of impressionism. And it's wet on wet. The most important aspect to understand is that there is no drying time between anything. We're not letting something sit for a week or 2 weeks because it's in oil to allow it to dry. It has to be able to be worked wet on wet. Once you get into the habit of playing with your paint, it doesn't become too much of an issue, and you get to learn what works, what doesn't work. If you buy canvas boards, they're relatively inexpensive to play with. You can also get small canvases to actually practice that particular thing. The idea is just to let your imagination go. It doesn't have to be a landscape, it could be anything at all. It could be a portrait of a person, it could be a portrait of an animal, it could be whatever you decide it happens to be. It could be a loaf of bread on the table that you're creating as a still life. The most important aspect that you have to remember all the time is that what we need you to do is just paint. Don't think about it, just paint. Thanks for watching.